Hi, I'm Amy. Thank you for tuning in. Today I'm joined by the absolutely lovely and very talented Alex FOULKES, who is the author of Rules for Vampires and the upcoming sequel. Oh, there's the first one. And the upcoming sequel, which is coming out in September. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to have some vampire chat with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm well excited. Thank you for having me.
I always love interviewing authors, but interviewing an author who writes vampire books and is a vampire fan, I think is just that extra bit exciting for me. I'll try not to say the word Buffy too much in advance. I apologise if I do.
Oh, that's fine by me.
What's the answer to every question? Buffy. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about your vampire book and vampire series, if you'd like to talk us through what you've done so far?
Yeah, of course. So thank you so much. So this is Rules for Vampires. Ta-da!
Oh, it's so gorgeous.
As you can see, beautiful picture there of Leo on the cover, illustrated by illustrator Sarah Ogilvie. You can see her name there at the bottom. So Rules for Vampires is the story of Leo von Motterberg. Leo is 11 years old, but she's been 11 for 100 years. So I need to make sure I get this right, but she is a century, a decade, and 1 year old. And it's her birth night when we first meet her. So it's her 100th night as a vampire. When you are the daughter of a noble vampire clan, there are certain expectations of you and certain things that you need to do, certain pressures. And I think the most challenging one is definitely when you have to go out and hunt on your own. And this is where we join Leo at the beginning of the story, when she has to set out through the deep, dark Dreadveld, which is the vast forest that surrounds her home on Mount Moth, and go and hunt a human for the very, very first time. The stakes are super high. You know, there's absolutely no room for error.
Stakes are high.
It's all got to go absolutely perfectly. But
Sorry, I
wish I could say I meant to do that, but no, that's absolutely right. Let me just make a mental note of that, because I remember take that joke into schools with me.
The stakes are even higher in book 2. That's what you need to say.
Yes, thank you. I will. But of course, you know, I mean, there's a snag in the plan and everything goes horrendously wrong. And I guess the spanner in the works is most definitely the wicked orphan master. So he is the evil, neglectful guardian of the children down in the human town of Otto's End. And in the ensuing fight at the beginning of Rules for Vampires, Leo accidentally creates two ghosts who are at war with each other. So not only do we have the worlds of the vampires, but we have the worlds of the ghosts. And it's then up to Leo to team up with ghost girl Mina and defeat the wicked orphan master before he can destroy the forest, and before Leo's evil, powerful vampire mum finds out what she's done. And that's essentially the beginning of the book, and it all kind of gets a bit more bonkers from there.
It does, and I love that. And it made me smile too. Like, I love watching for commonalities in vampire stuff. So, like, is it short for Wilhelmina, Mina, from what I remember?
Yes, it is.
And I was like, oh gosh, like Dracula and like my Mina. So, like,
yes,
it just made me smile. And the fact, like, the idea of the first kill, and I've just started watching First Kill on Netflix.
On Netflix, yes,
obviously based on the book. So I was just interested. Maybe we can start by talking about that. Like, where did your vision of vampires come from? Because I love looking for kind of differences and similarities between them. And obviously you've got a very set kind of historical, like you said, there's a historical culture and pattern to do with your vampires. Can you tell us a little bit about where all that came from?
Yeah, of course. So I think essentially I'm a thief, which doesn't sound very good. But, you know, there's such kind of iconic settings and tropes in vampire literature and in Gothic literature, you know, particularly thinking about, you know, your 18th century and 19th century novels. So, for example, looking at the setting, you've got your isolated fortress on the mountaintop. So that's Castle Motterberg. You've got the sort of Uberwald-esque, deep, dark endless forest, like, you know, deep as an ocean. If you walk in there, you are never getting out alive, and that is the Dread Vault. You know, you've got your ramshackle kind of medieval town where the humans are kind of like sitting ducks and are being picked off by monsters emerging from the mists. When I was writing Rules for Vampires, I mean, that kind of sort of medieval, you know, thinking about like sort of roughly 15th century Germany. That sort of setting was definitely what I wanted to play with. And, you know, please don't get me wrong, because I love looking at more modern vampires as well, and vampires set in other periods. But I think when we think about vampires as we know them, most definitely, you know, the influence of things like Dracula, the influence of like settings like, you know, your Castle of Otranto with the weird like moving walls and passageways, and you know, deep dark family secrets and things like that, like the weird science in Frankenstein. I think because I love it so much, I kind of wanted to write, I guess, kind of like an homage to it, kind of a bit of a love letter, I guess. And I feel kind of bad, like being here, like, you know, like I didn't want to reinvent the wheel or do anything too fresh. But I think I kind of created this playground based on what I knew, and then kind of ran with that and put my own twist on it. Which was really, really fun, I have to say. Really,
well, I think that comes across. I do think that the books that I like the most are the ones where authors have real passion like that. And I don't know, I think that you can draw on, especially with vampires, like people aren't expecting you to completely 100% reinvent it. We know that there are core aspects of being a vampire that people expect. And I think whenever an author tries to go too far with it, like I know that the Twilight books took some flack for the sparkly vampire skin and things like that. You know, I'm not going to diss any vampire interpretation, like to me,
another kind of vampire.
But and it makes it memorable and different. But I think people just have a core expectation, don't they? And for the kids that you're writing for some of them, how cool is it that yours might be some of the first vampires that they've really engaged with? Like,
yeah, I know.
What does that feel like? Because I know that I think teens that read mine are kind of familiar with the idea of a vampire. Like, what's it like that you might be introducing a new generation to what might become like their favorite monster?
Oh gosh, I mean, it would be, yeah, make me cry. I'm sorry, I am quite a soft person.
Yeah, I think, do it. You know, you're a soft person who writes terrifying books. I like that.
I think when people meet me, they're quite surprised sometimes at you know, how easily I kind of go to tear up. I think you know, it's a big responsibility to potentially have that happen, but I think it's also, you know, super, super lovely and super, super wonderful. If Rules for Vampires were, you know, to be like a springboard to go and, you know, jump into all of the amazing kind of vampire media that's out there, I think that would be just amazing, you know, to sort of be the first, but even to just be part of it in general, you know, I think is so lovely. And I know that a lot of young readers you know, may come across vampires after reading, for example, like, you know, Isadora Moon, Amelia Fang, or even, you know, further back, thinking about all of the really, really cute vampire picture books that we've had out lately. You know, it's nice kind of being the bridge between these wonderful books and all of the wonderful YA, as you know. Oh, as you've written. Thanks out there.
Just Mutual Appreciation Society, right?
Yeah.
We just love you.
We'll just pat ourselves on the back. Yeah. Let's just take a moment. Well done, everyone.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was just reading this book, Jampires, to my son, who is about about vampires that suck the jam out of donuts, and I was like, how did I not think of this? That's so cute. And he's quite obsessed with that. I'm just going to get one from the shelf. The little vampire Teddy from Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yes, Nightmare Before Christmas.
I once got asked that in an interview. Somebody asked about whether you know, younger readers should be reading about vampires and stuff like that. And I was like, yes. What did you dress up as Halloween when you were like 4? My son is 2 and he knows what a vampire is, in inverted commas. He could recognize a vampire. Don't think he's got the blood drinking part yet, but I don't.
There's no need for him to, though. You know, he's got that safe enjoyment, you know, sort of in a medium that's right for him and that's appropriate for him. Exactly. And I just think that's so lovely.
And in Isadora Moon, like, they drink red juice as the introduction to vampires, and I think that it's nice that there are these different steps. To me, like, goes Isadora, Amelia, and then you, and like, you know, the progression all the way up, and they need all of that. So this might be a good moment to talk then about how do you address vampires in a middle grade book? Because to me, the vampire that I've come to as an adult is knowing about the kind of sexy vampires like the Lestats and the sort of entanglement of relationships and vampire, like with stuff like Vampire Diaries, it's as much about relationship drama as it is about, you know, sucking blood and whatnot. It's like, how do you address that for a middle grade audience?
Yeah, you know, I think there is definitely a balance. And there's a balance that I have walked, not always so successfully. I mean, I think it's great having really knowledgeable editors who kind of have their finger on the button of what is and isn't okay.
Is there an example? Also, is there any particular thing where you've gone, oh, I overstepped that? Can you remember?
Oh, all the time. I mean, you know, there's so many fight scenes in Rules for Vampires, and there's even more in Ghost Bite Back, which is book 2. So that's coming very, very soon. One of the main things that we kind of did, I guess, to kind of ensure that we always had the audience in mind was making sure that any of the sort of fighting. So you've got Leo, for example, who is 11 and behaves like an 11-year-old. Mina is a similar age, and they are fighting a grown-up. They're fighting the Orphan Master. So one of the things that we did was to make sure that there is never a moment where there is like a physical a physical confrontation, like in a fight scene. It's all very supernatural, which I think really, really helps, you know, because it keeps that threat level high, it keeps the peril high, it keeps the excitement high, without straying into a territory which I really think, you know, doesn't belong in middle grade. But you know, I mean, what's scary is so subjective, and I think what's too scary is so subjective as well. So even though Vampires is suitable for ages 9 and up on paper, I always say, you know, to parents and guardians picking it up, you know, just be aware that it is a horror book. But the way that I tend to deal with that is by pairing it with the comedy and the sort of the funny elements. So even though Rules for Vampires is a scary book, it's also kind of packed full of these moments where you can kind of break the tension and have a bit of a giggle. There's kind of that safety and reassurance. And I hope that, you know, more sensitive readers, when they read it, even though Leo's world is very frightening, I hope that they can kind of feel like they could be, you know, Leo and Mina's friend and go along with them and kind of have that sort of comforting little bubble.
Yeah, it definitely does that. And I think the nice thing with a book like yours, I don't know, like the horror's kind of signposted, isn't it? Like the creepiness is building up. And I think that with a horror film, it's maybe a bit harder to escape when it's sort of thrown in your face. I think in a book, your imagination is sort of the limit of it, isn't it? So you've got the creepy little kids like me who are like, oh, how bloody can I make this in my head? Whereas another kid might just kind of read that bit really fast and there's no blood, it's fine. I think that there's a nice thing with books as an introduction to horror for that you can kind of, your imagination can take you.
Yeah, theatre of the mind. And I think that this is why I've always fared better with books. In a way, kind of, you know, the gorier the better for me in a story. Whereas if I'm watching a horror film, then I'm fairly likely to be hidden behind the sofa or having a little cry.
See, I like both, but it's interesting in mine. The only bit I can think that my agent made me take out was a bit where I wasn't talking about my characters. My character was explaining about a serial killer, like a real one, who did some flesh peeling and made things out of human flesh. And she was like, "Can we just have a little bit less of the peeling?" I was like, "Okay, I can probably rein that in a little bit." So it didn't actually impact on the book, but it was just the one bit where she went, "You just gone that step too far." And I've just written an adult short story recently. I was like, oh gosh, there isn't really a step too far. Like I can, because it's a werewolf book, so there's some kind of like claw fighting and stuff, and I could just be as visceral, emphasis on the viscera as I wanted. It was quite strange to go, okay, how can, and I actually was trying to push myself the opposite way, like have I written this like a YA author, or could I go a step further with this and just make it a little bit a little
Very
bit more vivid and
interesting.
a little bit more visual. So yeah, it is fun, and I'm looking forward to writing for a different audience, but like a younger audience. Every time I try, it just slips into YA. Like I usually write horror and it ends at YA for adults, or I start writing middle grade and it turns into YA anyway. So I think that's where I naturally fit. But
Yeah, maybe that's just sort of where your kind of inspiration, where your reference
yeah,
lie,
possibly.
perhaps. So
Was yours always a middle grade book, like from the very beginning? Did you know that that's what you wanted to write?
yes, yeah, it was. And the reason being was that it was initially written for the children in my school library.
Oh, that's
Um,
amazing, really.
yeah, yeah.
You're
So
so sweet, like
basically,
honestly.
oh, thank you. I don't know about that. I
You
don't know
are
about
like who writes a whole book for the kids in the library? That's amazing.
well, I mean, I didn't think I didn't think it would ever happen. So essentially this was pre-lockdown and pre you know, kind of COVID-19 when it was all kicking off. Um, essentially I've always written in the library with the kids. Um, but I'd never tried writing for a younger audience before, and there's a couple of reasons for that, but mostly it kind of stems around being intimidated by how difficult it is to write for kids because they won't put up with, you know, they won't put up with something that they don't like. You know how
Yeah.
like a grown up will you know, sort of give something a chapter or two before making a judgment. Kids won't do that. They're much more like, yeah, I don't want to read this, it's rubbish, I'm gonna, you know. um there was a lad who came into the library and essentially said very, very offhandedly, Miss Fowkes, will you write us a vampire story? Because within our stock, he'd exhausted everything we had. He'd run out of stuff to read, basically, and we were trying to get more in. But I said to him, you know, yeah, sure. Yeah, of course I will. Yeah, of course I will. I'll go and give it a go, thinking there's no way, I'm way too busy. You know, I'm never going to be able to, you know, come up with anything that's going to be good enough. But then when I went home, and I can probably find you, of course I can, it's right here. So this illustration
Oh,
by
cool.
Sarah Ogilvie, the artist, you can see there Leo running through the forest.
Oh, that's
Um,
amazing.
this was like the initial image. So I had this picture in my head of
Oh,
like a
wow.
weird vampire girl like running through the forest. And this is kind of where it all began. So I always
Mm.
say to kids who are getting into writing, you know, don't try and do the whole book in one go. Don't try and just go huh, and have the whole thing fully made. Like you have to kind of start small and build it up. And that's really where it began. Um, I did kind of know when I started it that it was a story that I really wanted to share.
Mm.
It was kind of the first time that I'd written something and sort of gone, oh gosh, you know, maybe it has a chance. It has, you know, a small chance, but a chance. Yeah, and that's really kind of where I got my start. I was very lucky, you know, that he chose to come in on that particular day.
That is
Or I
so
never would have done
amazing.
it.
To ask you as well, because obviously you'd got that in you, whether it took him to bring it out of you or not. Like you could have said that to any teacher or librarian and they'd have gone, no. Okay, no.
Yeah, I know. Right place at the right time, I think,
Yeah, that's
really. But
amazing.
it's
So did
just
you
goes to
then,
show. Oh, sorry, go on.
sorry, I was just going to say, did you query agents with that book then that you wrote for your
Yes.
library? That's awesome.
Yes, yeah. So it's always been called Rules for Vampires from the very
Oh,
beginning.
really? That's so cool.
Yes, yes. And I think you know, having that title, I think really, you know, it just kind of it sums it up, you know, what you see is what you get, really. I was very, very fortunate. The whole kind of publishing journey, it was all very, very strange because it all happened for me during lockdown, you know, that had all kicked off. And I know that your experience was very, very
Yeah.
similar. Yeah, it was kind of wild, really.
Well, yeah, that's really cool how a child who is sort of ultimately the audience you're writing for is the actual inspiration. Like I know the inspiration can be
Right.
children in a broader sense, but you like had the actual one little boy
Yeah,
who did
yeah.
that
And
for
then I
you.
could, you know, sort of bring snippets and character ideas to the kids. Hey, what do you think about this? Do you like this? You know, and I think they were all very kind of very, very encouraging. You know, it's difficult not to get a big head with the kids because they're always like, oh yeah, it's amazing, it's great, we love it, you know. But they were so hungry for it. it was lovely. It really was. It was great to see. And so nice as well that as I was writing it, I kind of had like a little gang of kids who were all working on their own stuff as well.
Yeah, that's nice.
Which is wonderful. I mean, it's just another reason why having a school librarian is so important, a vital member of staff. And I've met some wonderful school librarians, going into schools as well. I just think the library is such a special place, and to have a book that sort of had its beginnings in the library, it's just such a lovely thing, to come out and talk to people about.
Yeah, it's a lovely story for kids, isn't it? Because I think that's an awesome story that they can relate to, and that they've seen school librarians and teachers and teaching assistants. So to know that somebody that they're familiar with can go and write a book is quite powerful, because that means that they can as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they are like 10 times better than me. I always say this, they make me look like rubbish. These kids, they're so great. I mean, the imagination is just like, above and beyond anything that I could envision. They are absolutely just bonkers, a lot of them.
Yeah. I don't think they've got anything,
talented.
They've not got anything kind of hampering their imagination in terms of worrying about the final audience. Have they, wondering what readers will think, or is this what my editor wants? Like, they just write for the pure gleeful joy of creating a story.
Yeah, they're very free.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of, what is difficult to tap into as a grown-up. But I always try to, in my first draft, I always try to just be, as crazy as possible, and then hone it in on the second one. So yeah.
That leads us quite nicely actually into, what does your writing process look like then, from that initial seed of an idea? Yeah. Like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, so I always like to start small. Usually, typically for me, it's a character. And I am quite a visual person, I guess, as well. I should say I'm rubbish at like drawing or anything like that, but I will typically have a particular image in my head that I will work from. And then all the other details just build up from there. It is definitely a struggle sometimes not to just like scrap everything I've done, not to be like, that's rubbish, because it builds up, and you have to just sort of keep going and sort of trust in the process and just sort of let it happen as it happens, I guess, in that first draft. I've seen writing advice that's like, hey, write your first draft for yourself. And I think that that's a really good kind of way of thinking about it, and then go back in and ensure that you are talking to your audience in your second draft, because then you're going to come up with something that is authentically you. And has a bit of heart in it, and is genuine, and is something that you can sort of put in front of people and be proud of it. And I write, I write here on my laptop, I write in little notebooks, I write on scraps of paper. I've written on the loo, I'm not ashamed to say. I've written at like 3 a.m. on my phone because I haven't been able to sleep. All over the place, really. But I'm not one of these that's like, I need to write every day or else I'm not a real writer. I write whenever I can. And sometimes I can't stop, and sometimes I just can't start, and find it really tough and really struggle with that old writer's block. So I think really just a really normal writerly experience. You're nodding along.
Yeah, it's reassuring. I mean, you meet the occasional person who's like, yeah, I wrote in 2 weeks, I edited it in 2 weeks, and then it went to my publisher, and you're like, oh, okay, fine. I don't know what to say about that. But I don't know. I think maybe it's a personality thing partially. I think we were saying before we started recording that quite often writers can be a little bit introverted, or sort of perfectionists, or people. We're very creative, and you've got lots of little pockets of thought, haven't you? And then you have to bring these into a cohesive whole that other people can understand as well.
Yes.
Which is fun, but challenging.
That's great.
So on the subject of writer's block, how did you find approaching a sequel? Because I found it difficult, the thought that book one, you kind of write thinking, maybe I'll get an agent, but if I don't, nobody will read it. And like you said, with kids, that feels quite freeing. But I found when it came to book two that there was an expectation that people who liked book one, I knew they all like different things. So I was like, some people like romance, some people don't like romance, some people don't like horror, some people want more of it. And you kind of sit there thinking, oh, I can't please all these people. What do I do? So How did it feel for you? Did you manage to put that aside, or did you have similar angst that I did?
Yes, yeah, I did find it a vastly different experience. I really enjoyed writing book two, in that I think that it is bigger. I think that it is funner. You know, there's more fights, more jokes. You know, all my favorite returning characters plus new characters. But then at the same time, you also have the struggle of, you know, having written a book in 2 years and 10 months to finish Rules for Vampires. Ghost Spike Back has had to be sort of turned around within a year. And that's, you know, a vastly, vastly different writing schedule, on top of promoting the first book, on top of, you know, all the little extra bits that you're making for schools and making resources and, you know, thinking about what you're going to do potentially, you know, going forward in the series. You know, book two, I definitely had that kind of book two syndrome. It was a challenge, most definitely. So I'm with you there. We're in the same boat, and I think that you know sum it up so perfectly with the expectations and just kind of thinking, you know,
Hello.
What do people want from us, Mac? You know, this is Mac, co-author.
Hi, Matt.
What did you think of book two?
It's like it took my owner away, so I'm not sure about it. More feeds and
Not
puddles
sure.
than fighting.
But yeah, it was.
What do you do then when you're feeling that kind of stasis of I can't write this book? Like, what do you do about it?
Yeah, I think having fresh eyes is really important, and typically working on something else is the best way to go. So for me, that is jumping to a different chapter, or you know, a different scene, because there's some parts of it that just absolutely rocketed along, you know, and other parts where it becomes a bit like pulling teeth, you know, which again, very apt for a vampire, but maybe that's another pun that I'll use in schools.
Like pulling fangs, yeah.
Yeah, like pulling fangs. You know, I think just being able to keep your confidence up and don't worry, you know, because everyone I think struggles with this. I've yet to meet someone who's like, you know, oh yeah, I just, it just comes so naturally to me and I can do it every day, you know, and I never have a problem. And I think if anyone said that to me, I wouldn't believe them. I'd be like, are you sure? Are you sure?
See, I do try to write every day when I'm not like, I'm in deep in promotion of book two at the minute, so I'm not getting much writing time. But because I can only fit my writing into 2 or 3 hours a day when my toddler's asleep in an evening, so he goes to bed at 7 and it's like, I actually have to write now, otherwise I won't get any other time in the day. So I have to be a little bit more, so I have to write through it a little bit. And I sometimes do that by, like if a scene's not working, I just put a little holding, like a few bullet points in there. I'm typing them for you now just to show you what it is. So I put the holding, I put the holding scenes in there. And then I move on. And like you said, it's just kind of, I sometimes just need that word count to keep going up. Like I need 1,000 words a day generally to meet the deadlines that I'm on. And sometimes that 1,000 words is me sort of writing things like Mina is walking into the room, and it like feels like, oh, I'm sometimes overwriting just so I can meet the word count, but then that's what the editing's for, and you can take out that whole scene where you were just waffling on because you needed to hit a word count that day.
Yeah, just have to keep going, keep your mojo going, keep your confidence up. Yeah, that's good advice. Amy.
Yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted, is it? So you do have to have some self-belief and confidence in what you're doing.
Yeah, you do. You have to kind of champion yourself.
Yeah, and you're the one who's responsible for that first draft. Although there are editors and other people, like my husband always reads stuff for me as well, and he's really helpful. But you've got to get that vision, whatever other people are saying to you and readers are saying to you, you know, it's your baby, isn't it, and your thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's scary, isn't it? But I think, you know, it's lovely as well.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'm just going to check because I've just gone completely on a tangent of, I wanted to talk to you. So I really like your settings and your characters, and I think that you describe the kind of the Gothic settings was such a vivid thing for me. I know you've talked about it a little bit so far. And the characters, I liked how some of them are sort of that archetypal villain or they start that way and then you get the different layers of them. Have you got any like advice either for both or one or the other for developing settings and characters? Because those, I loved everything about the book, but you kind of, they're the things that really shone for me that I wanted to ask you about. Like, how do you do that?
Oh, well, thank you ever so much. I'm just going to put young man down while I explain this, just because he's being very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I've already, kind of mentioned about, these specific vampire tropes that I definitely didn't want to shy away from. I think that they were definitely like a big inspiration to me, like thinking about like vampire stories that I've loved in the past, kind of vampire films and vampire media that I've really, really loved in the past. And also, like you said about the Gothic, like it doesn't necessarily have to be vampires. I just think that thinking about that setting in particular, of the creepy isolated fortress, of that sense of kind of being trapped and being isolated, of this sense of like, a monster in the darkness that's watching. Like I think that's just so super iconic, and that's something that I really, really wanted to play with. I guess that's really just like, writing what you really love, write something that genuinely influences you and that you are very, very interested in. So for another writer, it might not be kind of the sort of creepy medieval Bavaria kind of setting. It might be like, perhaps it's like a sci-fi, like outer space, or like a kind of like Wild West. I don't know. I'd say I'm going off on a complete and utter tangent now. Should we talk about characters?
Yeah, that's fine. No, I feel like
that'd be a good idea. There's me just like blah blah blah.
No, it's fine. You've already touched on it, so I just wondered if there's any other kind of advice. But if you, definitely tell us, because I think your villains, linking back to what you said about middle grade, like treading the boundary, I think that I mean, you can call her mum a villain or not, it depends on your interpretation. But
I do.
She has her strongly, she has her very strongly villainous qualities, should we say? And then you've got the kind of more archetypal bad guy who's there, hovering in the wings.
Yes.
So how did you go about? Because you go all kind of ranges of characters, I think, from the sort of the sweetly bumbling dad to the absolutely terrifying mom. Like, how do you approach character development to make them feel so distinct and sort of your own?
Yeah. So and again, I think every writer kind of approaches this a little bit differently. So I can only tell you what's worked for me. I think any character who's going to be really important to the story, and it doesn't matter whether they are like a really big important character like Lady Sieglinde, who absolutely, I'm really, really pleased that you think of her as a villain as well, because she very much is, all the way down to, so for example, someone like Rodrigo, who only appears in a couple of chapters, but again, very important, Leo's roommate, the talking spider. I think if you root something about them in real life, so for example, thinking about Rodrigo and also Marged, who's the family butler, they both kind of have this sort of anxious tendency to fuss, and they both care deeply about Leo, and they both kind of want it to be okay, but in different ways that kind of manifests, and you kind of like have this sort of this nagging spider in your sock drawer who's always like going on at you, and then you've got this enchanted suit of armor who's like coming in and moving all your things around. And I kind of put a bit of me into each of them, in order to kind of in order to make them feel like, even though they are fantastical creatures and fantastical characters, that they could exist within this world. They could be real, within the sort of the laws and the rules of this world. I think when you are writing a new character, if there is something about them that is related somehow to someone, like if there is like a kernel of truth in them, no matter what else you kind of like layer that up with, I think that they will have kind of like an authenticity to them, which helps. Because then you can kind of think, well, how would they react in this situation, or what would they say here, or how would this be different if this character were actually over here? It's interesting, I think, to think about, because then they start to feel real in your head. They start to feel like real people. which is maybe a bit scary sometimes, I suppose. But I'm not one of these that's been like, oh, I've had these voices in my head. My characters are whispering to me when I'm meant to be going to sleep. But sometimes it just gets perilously close to that.
Yeah, it's never happened to me. Although sometimes if I'm really deep in writing, you're in a monologue. Sometimes my inner monologue starts to sound like one of my characters. Like one of my characters, Libby's quite sarcastic. And I have like a little sarcastic thought, and I'm like, that was Libby, not me. Maybe I need to put the laptop down and like go and drink some water or something. So yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because they are all you, like from the most bloodthirsty kind of villainous, depraved sort of character that you're creating, like my serial killers who are just completely remorseless. They are also like I've had to find something about them to draw on. It's quite
come
interesting.
from you. That's worrying thought, isn't
it? It is just a little bit.
Yeah, just a bit.
And I wanted to ask about your characters as well, because like mine, I've got the vampire lore, and kind of what I wanted my vampires to be was really strong and scary, but not completely like devoid of weakness. And I think that whether it was a weakness of personality or a weakness of power, like for example daylight, I decided that daylight, my vampires will not go out in the day in the series, and that was going to be one of the limitations. What was it like doing that, because you've obviously got ghosts and vampires? Did you kind of have I nearly said rules for vampires, like a rule book for I'm going off, like I could feel myself slipping here. Try and be professional, come on. Did you have a sort of rule book of how, like, what would be the strengths, what would be the limitations of your ghosts and your vampires? Like how did you keep track of it, and how did you make sure they weren't too powerful?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, because that's something that I really, really struggled with. Because I think if you are going to include every single kind of vampire feature, like across vampires, throughout literature, if you were going to include every single one, you'd be here forever, and also your book would be full of contradictions, because there's certain things that don't mesh together. I think picking and choosing what was going to work for this particular world was really important. And I think actually you've hit the nail on the head there about kind of the vampire being super powerful, but also having these limitations. I think that's what makes the vampire so compelling, and that is what makes the vampire so interesting, kind of as that iconic horror creature. Yeah.
And what about ghosts then? Because I haven't really written about ghosts, so I've thought deeply about vampires, and like I could kind of see where you were drawing the lines in. Okay, this thing can hurt them, this thing can't. Like they have this strength, but they have this vulnerability. Like how does that work with ghosts? Because they haven't got a body. Like what do you do with that in terms of them just not drifting away into space, or like how corporeal do you make them? Like what was you thinking there?
Oh, well, that was definitely something that myself and the editors that I've worked with have gone back and forth on a lot for book 2, because so not to give like major spoilers, but the ghostly kind of element is explored in much more detail, and they have their own set of rules as well. They're called the ghostly guidelines. So I definitely had a lot of fun with that. I think a ghost is very, very interesting, and you're thinking about like all of the different ghosts that you have like in different cultures, and the way that they've manifested based on the influences like in different countries and kind of different folklore and things like that. There's much more ghosts than there are vampires.
Okay.
There's much more types of ghosts than there are vampires. But again, I just think knowing your rules in your thing that you're writing and sticking to those parameters. So, for example, in the world of rules for vampires, your ghost can touch and move and interact with stuff, but can also choose to become intangible. So this is a foe that is very, very dangerous, because they can, for example, a few spoilers here, but they can attempt to drop you off a cliff.
Oh, yes.
Drop a really heavy book on your head, flip you upside down and pin you against the ceiling. There's all these kind of there's a lot of potential for mayhem, I think, but then at the same time they have weaknesses that they are bound by. And like a huge element of book 1 is this idea of how to kill a ghost. Like how do you get rid of something that that you cannot like stake like a vampire, or you can't cut it down with iron like you could the Fae folk, or silver bullets like a werewolf. Like, all of these things aren't going to work, so what do you do? And that is, that's really what drives the plot of Rules for Vampires. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was just thinking, like, vampires and ghosts have that similar thing about them, don't they? That I think we're so fascinated, aren't we, as humans, with like mortality and the idea, like, what happens after life, and how could, what would it be like to be young and beautiful forever, but at this terrible cost of drinking blood? It's so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, what is it, do you think? Is there anything that we've not said about vampires? Like, why do people keep? I'm just looking at my shelves, and I've got like Stephen King and Scott Snyder's American Vampire, which is like, an adult comic book take, and then I've got your book behind me, which is like the middle grade, and then I've got the kind of cute, fluffy picture books in my son's room. Like, why do we keep coming back to vampires? Like, what is it about them?
That's a really good question, actually, and I've considered that quite a lot. I mean, my interest in vampires definitely kind of sparked during teenagerdom.
Yeah, same.
And I think it is, that idea of, like, if you think about Dracula, for example, I mean, Dracula is quite sexy, this aristocratic noble man who, when you look at him, he seems quite appealing at first, but there's something about him that's not quite right. But by the time you figure it out, he's already, you're doomed. It's too late. I think that there's something very, very compelling about that, but that's quite adult. And that's quite grown up, and I think that that's kind of where the how you were saying about like your teenage vampires, my boyfriend bit my neck and I love him.
No.
I think exactly. That's where that comes from, definitely. But I think really what it boils down to is that vampires are just really cool. I think all the powers that you get, while not being super overpowered due to like these important sort of laws and limitations, to kind of temper all of the amazing, like, cool vampiric powers, that have kind of featured throughout vampiric literature. I think they are actually just a really, really awesome monster. And so visually striking as well.
Yeah,
like, how you were saying about like dressing up for Halloween, having your little vampire outfit on. Everyone's going to know instantly that you are a vampire. If you've got the teeth, if you've got the cloak, then you are sorted. And maybe that's what really appeals. Perhaps, speaking as someone who has written a book that does not have romance in it.
Maybe one day. I think that you've got it in you. I can sense like you want to write these kind of sexy vampires as well. I mean, I was just looking at Spike on the shelf behind me as you're talking, like, about the visually cool aesthetics, like the long black leather jacket and the slick back blonde hair,
Yes.
And
I mean, I was always more of an Angel girl, but Spike, I understand.
But Angel was like my kind of 11, 12, 13. And then when I got to uni and I started watching it again, I was like, oh my God, Spike, where was he the first time I watched this? So yeah, it's very interesting how I think maybe when I was younger, like the Stefan and the Angel and the Louis, like the kind of sanitized version of the vampire who's really sorry about what they are, interested me. And now I'm an adult, it's like, oh, Spike and Damon and Lestat, like the ones, and Eric from True Blood, who just walk this line.
Oh gosh, don't even get me started on True Blood. Yes,
I've got the whole set of books like just there. I'm working my way through
House. Yeah, I read them. I read them as a teenager. I think I had like a bit of an awakening, to be honest.
I can imagine. I bet they taught you a lot of things.
Yes, things that I did not learn in Catholic school.
No, yeah. Oh gosh, Catholic school plus True Blood. That's like,
I know.
Yeah, and I don't know. I like the fact that, like, with Eric, like, there's the series, and it happens in the books and in the TV show, like, where he loses his memory and his identity, and kind of becomes this, like, husband type vampire who you could fall in love with, and then suddenly he's evil again, and you're like, ooh, but which is better? And I think that's why I'm interested in with vampires. Like, I'm not going to say too much about my books, but I did like exploring how can vampires still have qualities that are human, and can a vampire and a human be friends? Can they be in a relationship and stuff like that? I think
yes.
I'm infinitely excited and interested in that idea that, that they are essentially, one is the food source of the other. It's
Yes,
quite
yes.
fascinating.
That's very interesting, isn't it? And thinking about something like First Kill as well, exploring that sort of dynamic is very, very interesting for sure. That was definitely kind of a something that I wanted to draw on, in Rules for Vampires, with the friendship between Leo and Mina, who get their beginning when Leo inadvertently inadvertently causes Mina's death, but the plan was always to bite her and drink her blood.
Yeah.
So if you ever feel like you've made a bad first impression on someone,
yeah, just think about
then you can think about that. Yeah.
I was going to murder you on purpose, but no, I'm just going to do it accidentally. Yeah.
Yes.
And she was great though. I loved that, the kind of weighing up of what kind of vampire and what kind of person she wants to be. I think is really relatable for any human, but for kids as well, who their personalities are still quite malleable at that age. Like with your kind of 9 to 12, I think is where a lot of people really come into their own and they discover their real interests. And I remember I used to teach year fives, and you can have a really adult conversation with them. And sometimes you're like thinking, like, where did this all come from? Like, you're only 9, you haven't had that much experience, but
Old souls.
yeah.
Yeah, they can be super insightful, most definitely.
And then they can say some silly stuff where you're just like, oh, you're definitely still a kid. That's great. But that's why they're so fun, isn't it?
Yeah, most definitely. I agree.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you now. We're going to talk a little bit more about vampires. Are there any? You've talked about the kind of traditional and classic vampire literature.
Yeah.
Is there any modern vampire, whether they're inspirations or whether they're favourites? Is there any modern vampire stuff? You mentioned True Blood, but what are your favourite vampire things? I'd like to know.
Yeah. So again, I think for me, kind of the vampire aesthetic and sort of their place in my mind is definitely kind of rooted in that gothic sort of imagery and media that really plays on that. So it's all kind of one and the same for me, like thinking about what I was watching when I was growing up. So it was things like Mona the Vampire on television, although I know that they are books and I believe maybe comics as well. I would love to get my hands on them because I just think that they are so great. Things like the 90s Addams Family films.
Oh yeah.
You know which ones I mean?
Yeah. I do, the Addams Family and the Addams Family Values, yeah.
Yes, I mean Addams Family Values was my absolute favourite. The one
where same. For some reason. I didn't own the Addams Family. I owned the Addams Family Values, so I get really confused when people talk about the Addams Family. I'm like, that's not the Addams Family film. Then I realise I had the sequel, not the.
Yes, it is so good though, and I think it's proof as well that a sequel can be better than the original. I think it's just because it had Joan Cusack in it. It was great. Although the first one was great as well. You know, things like The Little Vampire, if you remember that. Casper the Friendly Ghost. Tim Burton movies, particularly Nightmare Before Christmas, Corpse Bride. Edward Scissorhands, Coraline and Paranorman. Have you ever seen Paranorman?
I haven't actually.
Oh God, Amy, you would love it. It's so good. It's by Leica Studios. It's stop motion. But that is great. And all of these are kind of like, sort of like monster movies, not necessarily like, vampire, but I think sort of within that sort of creepy ballpark that I think are great. And then growing up a little bit, things like your Southern Vampire Mysteries, like Buffy, like Sleepy Hollow. As a teenager, I picked up Interview with the Vampire as well for the first time and read that. And I think, the character of Claudia in that was definitely a big influence on me for Rules for Vampires, and the character of Emmeline, who's Leo's sister. Who is forever trapped in the body of a toddler, despite being mentally a teenager and has grown up and is growing up. Is kind of stuck with this floppy little body that she is very frustrated by. I think that all of these things, growing up, thinking back on it now and thinking back on what I really enjoyed when I was younger, I can definitely sort of like feel echoes of them in what I've written. And again, I think that just comes back to that idea of, just put part of yourself into your writing, something that is genuinely you, and And I think that definitely comes through, hopefully in a way that is palatable for the reader. But I read it and I'm like, yeah, I love this. Yeah.
Oh, honestly, I did write this thinking, is anybody else going to understand these pop culture references? Will anybody know that I'm actually describing a song from a Buffy episode without naming the Buffy episode? And so many people messaged me like, you put that Rasputina song in from episode whatever of season 2, and I was like, yes, I did. Thank you. I'm glad you get it. It's interesting, isn't it? There are more of us out there than you realise when you start writing a book like this that have that. Sure. As soon as you say vampire, and you see some people look confused, and some people go, yeah, vampire. And then you're like, yes, I'm going to talk to you. Yeah, the people at work, when I told them I'd written a book and it was going to be published, they were like, unicorns, fairies, and I was like, vampires, murder, serial killers. I'm like, what about the unicorn? No, there were no unicorns. You said unicorns, something else. Like, no, just like same as you. I think it's interesting how we can have different elements of our personalities that we draw on, and that's obviously the one we show to the world isn't necessarily. Okay, so I just have one series of questions, and they're the kind of silly quickfire ones. So I just want you to tell me the first thing that comes into your head.
Yeah.
Favorite vampire?
Nadja from What We Do in the Shadows.
Okay, good answer.
Yes.
Favorite vampire book?
Let the Right One In for grown-ups.
Yeah.
For children, anything Amelia Fang. Barbaric Bull.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Favorite vampire movie?
Van Helsing. With the one with Hugh Jackman.
Yes, Lost Boys for me is recently kind of. When I reflect, I'm like, I think Lost Boys is my ultimate.
Yes. I think a lot of people would agree with you. And that's had so many, me talking about What We Do in the Shadows earlier. Like, I know that was a big influence. The Lost Boys. There's definitely some of the gags in that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And last one, vampire TV show.
Oh.
You can
I think it does have to be What We Do in the Shadows. I'm sorry. Yeah. I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, I enjoyed the film. And I love the film, but I also love the TV show, and I mean, Nadja in particular is my absolute fave just because she is so kind of crazy and free and, is just doing what on earth she wants when she wants to do it, which I think is just quintessential vampire. So.
It is, and nice that she's a female vampire as well, because I think the ones I've listed, like the Erics and Damons and the Starks, like it's quite often this kind of alpha male sort of vampire. It's nice to see that in a different kind of character as well. Maybe that's a good place to end. We'll end on our strong female vampires.
I love that. That's very fitting.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I knew that I'd have a really good time talking to you. I didn't realise quite how much we could talk about vampires. I think this might be one of the longest interviews I've done, which I'm quite happy with.
Sorry, it's me. I'm a chatterbox.
Yeah, me too. So it obviously works well. And, we love what we do. We obviously love our vampires, and that hopefully comes through our books. So thank you so much. Can you remind us the title of book 2 and when it comes out?
Yes, so it's called Ghosts Bite Back, and it's out on the 29th of September here in the UK. I think that the US date will follow. So watch this space.
Okay, that's so exciting. I will update if we get any information about the US. I'll put it in the comments as well. Thanks so much, Alex, and thank you everybody for watching. As always, likes and subscribes are really appreciated. I do have more vampire author interviews lined up, so stay tuned for those. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Thank you.